Question 1. Research into a client's stated desire to invest a significant portion of their savings into a high-risk, illiquid alternative investment product, despite the client having a low-risk tolerance and short-term financial goals, requires a professional to. Option A. Recommend a slightly less risky but still highly speculative product that aligns more closely with the client's stated preference for high returns, while downplaying the associated risks. Option B. Inform the client that their request cannot be fulfilled due to regulatory restrictions and suggest they seek advice from a different professional. Option C. Proceed with the client's requested investment, assuming the client understands the risks involved and has the ultimate authority to make their own investment decisions. Option D. Conduct a thorough assessment of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment objectives to determine if the proposed product is suitable. And if not, explain the regulatory and suitability concerns to the client and propose alternative appropriate investments. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough assessment of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment objectives to determine if the proposed product is suitable, and if not, explain the regulatory and suitability concerns to the client and propose alternative appropriate investments. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preference and the regulatory requirements governing the sale of financial products. The EIAT and NEIEP test frameworks emphasize the paramount importance of client suitability and regulatory compliance. A professional must navigate this by prioritizing the client's best interests and adhering strictly to the rules, even if it means disagreeing with the client's initial request. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it upholds the core principles of regulatory compliance and client protection mandated by the EIAT and NEIEP test. It demonstrates a commitment to understanding the client's true financial situation and objectives, ensuring that any recommended product is suitable and aligns with regulatory guidelines. This proactive stance prevents potential harm to the client and avoids regulatory breaches. An incorrect approach that proceeds with the client's initial request without proper due diligence fails to adhere to the suitability requirements. This constitutes a regulatory failure, as it prioritizes a client's potentially ill-informed preference over their actual financial well-being and the regulatory mandate to offer appropriate products. Ethically, it is a breach of the professional's duty of care. Another incorrect approach that attempts to subtly steer the client towards a less suitable product while appearing to comply with the initial request is also a regulatory and ethical failure. This demonstrates a lack of transparency and honesty, undermining the trust essential in the client-professional relationship and potentially violating rules against misrepresentation or deceptive practices. A professional decision-making process in such situations should involve 1. Active listening and thorough fact-finding to understand the client's underlying needs and objectives, not just their stated desires. 2. Clear communication of regulatory requirements and the rationale behind suitability assessments. 3. Educating the client on why certain products may not be appropriate for their circumstances, even if they express interest. 4. Proposing alternative solutions that genuinely meet the client's needs and comply with all regulations. 5. Documenting all discussions, recommendations, and the client's final decisions, including any deviations from initial advice. Question 2. Examination of the data shows that a client has requested access to certain sensitive information that, while readily available, may be subject to specific disclosure restrictions under the EIAT and NEIEP test regulatory framework. The client has expressed urgency and a desire for immediate access without further verification. Option A. Proceed with providing the requested information after confirming that the disclosure aligns with all applicable EIAT and NEIEP test regulations and documenting the verification process. Option B. Provide the information immediately as requested by the client to maintain a positive client relationship, assuming the client understands the implications. Option C. Attempt to find a creative interpretation of the EIAT and NEIEP test regulations that would allow for the immediate disclosure of the information without explicit verification. Option D. Inform the client that the request cannot be fulfilled due to potential regulatory restrictions and offer no alternative solutions. Correct answer is A. Proceed with providing the requested information after confirming that the disclosure aligns with all applicable EIAT and NEIEP test regulations and documenting the verification process. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between client instructions and regulatory obligations. The EIAT and NEIEP test framework emphasizes the paramount importance of adhering to regulatory requirements, even when they may seem to contradict a client's immediate desires. The challenge lies in navigating this conflict while maintaining client trust and fulfilling professional duties. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes compliance with the EIAT and NEIEP test regulatory framework. Specifically, it acknowledges that the regulatory requirements for data handling and client communication are non-negotiable. By seeking clarification and ensuring all actions align with these regulations, the professional demonstrates integrity, upholds the integrity of the financial system, and protects both the client and the firm from potential regulatory breaches and associated penalties. This proactive stance ensures that client data is handled appropriately and that all disclosures are made in accordance with the prescribed standards. An incorrect approach that involves proceeding with the client's request without verifying regulatory compliance fails to uphold the professional's duty to the regulatory framework. This constitutes a significant regulatory failure, as it bypasses established protocols designed to ensure data integrity and client protection. Ethically, it breaches the principle of acting with due care and diligence, potentially exposing the client to risks and the professional to disciplinary action. Another incorrect approach that involves ignoring the client's request and unilaterally deciding on a course of action without communication also represents a failure. While it might inadvertently lead to regulatory compliance, it neglects the professional obligation to communicate effectively with the client, understand their needs within regulatory bounds, and explain any limitations imposed by the regulatory framework. This can damage the client relationship and is a failure in professional conduct. A further incorrect approach that involves attempting to find a loophole or an interpretation that circumvents the spirit of the regulation, even if technically compliant, is ethically dubious. This demonstrates a lack of commitment to the underlying principles of the EIAT and NEIEP test framework and can lead to unintended consequences or a perception of impropriety. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the applicable regulatory framework. When faced with a conflict, the professional should first identify the specific regulations that apply. Next, they should assess the client's request against these regulations. If there is any ambiguity or potential conflict, the professional should seek clarification from their compliance department or a qualified legal advisor. Communication with the client should then focus on explaining the regulatory constraints and proposing compliant alternatives, rather than simply agreeing to or refusing the request outright. The ultimate goal is to achieve the client's objectives in a manner that is fully compliant with all relevant laws and guidelines. Question 3. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a candidate for the EIAT and NEIEP test is preparing by reviewing a broad range of international financial regulations. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the jurisdictional requirements for the EIAT and NEIEP test? Option A. Prioritizing the review of regulations from countries with the most stringent financial oversight, assuming these will cover the requirements of the EIAT and NEIEP test. Option B. Applying general best practices in financial regulation that are widely accepted across multiple jurisdictions, without specific reference to the EIAT and NEIEP test framework. Option C. Focusing exclusively on the specific regulatory framework, laws, and guidelines mandated for the EIAT and NEIEP test, ensuring no external or generic regulatory principles are incorporated. Option D. Incorporating principles from U.S. financial regulations and UK/CISI guidelines to provide a comprehensive understanding of global compliance standards. The correct answer is C. Focusing exclusively on the specific regulatory framework, laws, and guidelines mandated for the EIAT and NEIEP test, ensuring no external or generic regulatory principles are incorporated. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to navigate the complex and evolving landscape of regulatory compliance within the financial services sector, specifically concerning anti-money laundering (AML) and counter-terrorist financing (CTF) obligations. The challenge lies in accurately identifying and applying the correct regulatory framework to a given situation, ensuring that all actions taken are in strict adherence to the specified laws and guidelines, and avoiding any misinterpretation or overreach that could lead to regulatory breaches or reputational damage. The need for absolute priority to the EIAT and NEIEP test-specific regulatory framework is paramount, demanding a precise understanding of its scope and limitations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach is to meticulously identify and apply the specific regulatory framework mandated for the EIAT and NEIEP test. This involves understanding that the EIAT and NEIEP test operates under a defined set of rules, and any deviation or reliance on external or generic principles would be a direct violation of the examination's jurisdictional requirements. Best professional practice dictates a strict adherence to the prescribed regulatory environment, ensuring that all knowledge and application are confined to the specified laws and guidelines. This approach guarantees that the individual demonstrates competence within the exact parameters of the assessment, which is the core objective of the EIAT and NEIEP test. Incorrect approach is analysis. Relying on general principles of financial regulation or best practices from other jurisdictions would be a significant regulatory and ethical failure. The EIAT and NEIEP test explicitly demands adherence to its own defined framework. Introducing concepts or rules from, for example, U.S. regulations or UK/SISI guidelines, when the exam jurisdiction is clearly defined as EIAT and NEIEP, demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of the examination scope and a failure to comply with its core instructions. This is not merely an academic error, but a breach of the examination's integrity, as it suggests an inability to follow explicit instructions and a lack of discipline in applying the correct knowledge base. It also risks providing answers that are factually incorrect within the context of the EIAT and NEIEP test's regulatory environment. Failing to recognize the absolute priority of the EIAT and NEIEP test's regulatory framework and instead prioritizing a broader, more comprehensive understanding of financial regulations from multiple sources would also be a failure. While a broad understanding can be beneficial in a professional career, for the purpose of this specific examination, it is a distraction and a potential source of error. The examination is designed to test knowledge of a particular regulatory set, not a general overview. This approach would lead to answers that are not tailored to the specific requirements of the EIAT and NEIEP test, thus failing to meet the assessment's objectives. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such a scenario must first and foremost identify the precise jurisdictional boundaries and regulatory frameworks that govern the situation. In the context of the EIAT and NEIEP test, this means recognizing that the examination itself defines the sole relevant regulatory universe. The decision-making process should involve a rigorous self-check. Am I applying only the rules and guidelines specified for the EIAT and NEIEP test? If the answer is anything other than a definitive yes, the approach must be revised. This involves prioritizing clear, explicit instructions over assumptions or broader knowledge. Professionals should develop a habit of dissecting examination requirements and regulatory mandates to ensure absolute alignment before formulating any response. Question 4. To address the challenge of a client engaging in transactions that appear to be structured to avoid reporting thresholds, what is the most appropriate regulatory compliance action for a professional subject to the EIAT and NEIEP test guidelines? Option A. Advise the client on how to structure their transactions to remain below reporting thresholds, thereby avoiding regulatory attention. Option B. Directly question the client about their transaction structuring and the reasons behind it, without consulting internal compliance. Option C. Immediately report the suspicious activity to the firm's compliance department for further investigation and potential reporting to the relevant authorities. Option D. Continue to process the transactions as usual, assuming the client is acting within their legal rights and avoiding unnecessary scrutiny. Correct answer is C. Immediately report the suspicious activity to the firm's compliance department for further investigation and potential reporting to the relevant authorities. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between client confidentiality and the regulatory obligation to report suspicious activities. Professionals must exercise careful judgment to balance these competing demands, ensuring compliance with EIAT and NEIEP test regulations without unnecessarily breaching client trust. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes adherence to the EIAT and NEIEP tests' explicit requirements for reporting suspicious transactions. This aligns with the regulatory framework's objective of preventing financial crime and maintaining market integrity. By seeking guidance from the compliance department, the professional demonstrates due diligence and a commitment to acting within the established legal and ethical boundaries. This proactive step ensures that any reporting is done correctly, with appropriate documentation, and in accordance with internal procedures, thereby mitigating personal and firm liability. An incorrect approach that involves ignoring the suspicious activity due to client relationship failures to comply with the EIAT and NEIEP tests reporting obligations. This constitutes a serious regulatory breach and an ethical lapse, potentially exposing the professional and their firm to significant penalties. It undermines the integrity of the financial system and can facilitate illicit activities. Another incorrect approach, such as directly confronting the client about the suspicion without proper authorization or procedure, is also professionally unacceptable. This action could tip off the client, allowing them to conceal or move illicit funds, thereby thwarting regulatory investigations. It also violates internal firm policies and potentially jeopardizes the investigation by compromising evidence. Furthermore, it could lead to a breakdown in the professional relationship and potential legal repercussions for the professional. The professional reasoning framework for similar situations involves a systematic process. First, identify the potential regulatory breach or ethical concern. Second, consult the relevant internal policies and procedures, as well as the specific requirements of the EIAT and NEIEP test. Third, seek guidance from the compliance department or legal counsel. Fourth, act in accordance with the advice received, ensuring all actions are documented. Finally, maintain client confidentiality to the extent permitted by law and regulatory obligations. Question 5. Analysis of a scenario where a financial firm's internal policy mandates that all employees preparing for the EIAT and NEIEP test must utilize only proprietary training modules developed in-house, even if these modules do not cover all topics outlined in the official EIAT and NEIEP test syllabus. The firm's compliance department is reviewing this policy in light of potential regulatory scrutiny. Which of the following actions best aligns with regulatory compliance and professional best practice for the EIAT and NEIEP test? Option A. Continue to enforce the internal policy, arguing that proprietary modules are sufficient and that the firm has the discretion to determine adequate preparation methods. Option B. Seek an exemption from the regulatory body to continue using only proprietary modules, citing the firm's investment in their development. Option C. Immediately revise the internal policy to mandate the use of official EIAT and NEIEP test study materials and resources as the primary preparation tools, supplementing with proprietary modules only where they add value beyond the official syllabus. Option D. Allow employees to choose between proprietary modules and official study materials, but require them to sign a waiver acknowledging that the firm is not responsible for any gaps in their knowledge due to their choice. The correct answer is C. Immediately revise the internal policy to mandate the use of official EIAT and NEIEP test study materials and resources as the primary preparation tools, supplementing with proprietary modules only where they add value beyond the official syllabus. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a firm's internal policies and the explicit requirements of regulatory bodies governing the EIAT and NEIEP test. The firm's policy, while seemingly aimed at efficiency, creates a potential barrier to compliance if it restricts access to necessary training materials or examination preparation resources. The core of the challenge lies in ensuring that all candidates are adequately prepared and have access to the same, approved resources, thereby upholding the integrity of the examination process and adhering to regulatory standards. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes regulatory compliance and fairness. By ensuring that all candidates have access to the official EIAT and NEIEP test study materials, the firm upholds the principle of equal opportunity in preparation. This aligns directly with the regulatory framework's objective of ensuring that all individuals undertaking the EIAT and NEIEP test possess the required knowledge and competencies, as assessed through a standardized and equitable examination process. This approach demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and professional responsibility by not allowing internal policies to supersede external regulatory mandates designed to protect the market and investors. An incorrect approach that restricts access to official study materials based on internal firm policies fails to meet regulatory requirements. This constitutes a significant regulatory failure, as it potentially disadvantages candidates, leading to an unfair assessment of their knowledge and skills. Ethically, it is a failure to uphold the integrity of the examination process and to treat all candidates equitably. Another incorrect approach might involve providing unofficial or condensed study guides that are not approved by the regulatory body. This is a regulatory failure because it deviates from the prescribed curriculum and assessment standards, potentially leading to candidates being tested on or missing crucial information. Ethically, it is a misrepresentation of the preparation provided and undermines the credibility of the EIAT and NEIEP test. A third incorrect approach could be to waive the requirement for certain candidates without explicit regulatory approval, which is a direct contravention of the established examination protocols and a severe regulatory and ethical breach. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear hierarchy of authority, where regulatory requirements always supersede internal firm policies when there is a conflict. Professionals must proactively identify potential conflicts between internal procedures and external regulations. They should then seek clarification from the relevant regulatory bodies or legal counsel if there is any ambiguity. The ultimate decision must be one that ensures full compliance with all applicable laws, regulations, and ethical standards, prioritizing the integrity of the financial markets and the protection of consumers. Question 6. Benchmark analysis indicates that a firm is experiencing significant growth pressure and is considering streamlining its client onboarding process to accelerate new client acquisition for its international equity trading services. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the regulatory framework and guidelines governing the EIAT and NEIEP test in ensuring client suitability and preventing market abuse? Option A. Allowing relationship managers to make independent judgments on client suitability based on their personal rapport and informal discussions, without a standardized assessment framework or documentation requirements. Option B. Relying primarily on a simplified online declaration form where clients self-certify their understanding of international equity markets and their risk tolerance, with minimal independent verification by the firm. Option C. Offering a limited range of high-risk, high-return international equity products to all new clients as a default, with the expectation that clients will opt out if they deem them unsuitable. Option D. Implementing a multi-stage suitability assessment that includes detailed questionnaires, interviews, and verification of client financial standing and investment objectives before offering any trading services, with all findings meticulously documented. The correct answer is D. Implementing a multi-stage suitability assessment that includes detailed questionnaires, interviews, and verification of client financial standing and investment objectives before offering any trading services, with all findings meticulously documented. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a firm's desire to expand its client base and the regulatory imperative to ensure suitability and prevent market abuse. The EIAT and NEIEP test frameworks emphasize the importance of robust compliance procedures, particularly concerning client onboarding and the provision of investment advice. Professionals must exercise careful judgment to balance business objectives with their fiduciary duties and regulatory obligations. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough and documented assessment of client suitability before offering any products or services. This aligns directly with the core principles of EIAT and NEIEP, which mandate that investment advice and product recommendations must be appropriate for the client's knowledge, experience, financial situation, and investment objectives. Documenting this assessment provides a clear audit trail, demonstrating compliance with regulatory requirements and protecting both the client and the firm. An incorrect approach that bypasses or inadequately performs the suitability assessment fails to meet regulatory standards. This could lead to clients being offered products they do not understand or cannot afford, increasing the risk of financial harm and regulatory sanctions. Ethically, it breaches the duty of care owed to clients. Another incorrect approach that relies solely on a client's self-declaration without independent verification is also problematic. While client input is crucial, firms have a responsibility to conduct their own due diligence to ensure the information provided is accurate and sufficient for a proper suitability assessment. This failure to independently verify can mask underlying risks and lead to inappropriate recommendations. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic review of regulatory requirements, a clear understanding of the firm's compliance policies, and a commitment to client best interests. When faced with pressure to onboard clients quickly or offer new products, professionals should always default to the most robust and compliant process, even if it requires more time or resources. This involves asking critical questions. Does this process adequately assess suitability? Is there sufficient documentation? And does this align with regulatory expectations and ethical standards? If any doubt exists, seeking guidance from compliance departments or senior management is essential. Question 7. Compliance review shows that a client has stated a very high risk tolerance and a desire for aggressive growth investments, yet their financial situation indicates a limited capacity to absorb significant losses and a short-term investment horizon for a substantial portion of their capital. Which of the following represents the most appropriate course of action for the financial advisor? Option A. Focus solely on the client's stated desire for high returns and recommend the highest risk investment products available to meet their growth objectives. Option B. Advise the client that their stated risk tolerance is incompatible with their financial situation and refuse to offer any investment recommendations until they revise their risk tolerance. Option C. Proceed with recommending aggressive growth investments as per the client's stated high risk tolerance, assuming the client fully understands the implications of their choices. Option D. Initiate a detailed discussion with the client to explore the reasons behind their stated risk tolerance, assess their understanding of investment risks, and explain how their financial capacity and time horizon influence the suitability of aggressive strategies, aiming to collaboratively adjust the investment plan. The correct answer is D. Initiate a detailed discussion with the client to explore the reasons behind their stated risk tolerance, assess their understanding of investment risks, and explain how their financial capacity and time horizon influence the suitability of aggressive strategies, aiming to collaboratively adjust the investment plan. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in financial advisory, where a client's stated risk tolerance appears to be misaligned with their financial situation and investment objectives. The professional must navigate the delicate balance between respecting client autonomy and fulfilling their fiduciary duty to provide suitable advice. Overlooking this discrepancy could lead to inappropriate investment recommendation, potentially causing significant financial harm to the client and regulatory breaches for the advisor. The challenge lies in identifying the root cause of this misalignment and addressing it constructively without alienating the client. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a multifaceted strategy to reevaluate the client's risk profile. This includes a deeper dive into their financial capacity for loss, their actual investment experience, and their understanding of investment risks. It requires open and honest communication, using clear, non-technical language to explain how their stated tolerance might not align with their financial reality or long-term goals. This aligns with regulatory requirements, as per EIAT and NEIEP test frameworks, that mandate suitability assessments and the obligation to act in the client's best interest. By seeking to understand the discrepancy and educating the client, the advisor upholds their fiduciary duty and ensures that investment recommendations are truly appropriate. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to simply accept the client's stated risk tolerance at face value, regardless of other indicators. This fails to meet the regulatory obligation to conduct a thorough suitability assessment and could lead to recommendations that are too aggressive or too conservative for the client's actual circumstances, potentially resulting in financial losses or missed opportunities. Ethically, it demonstrates a lack of diligence and a failure to act in the client's best interest. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the client's stated tolerance outright and impose the advisor's own judgment without further discussion or explanation. This undermines client autonomy and can damage the professional relationship. While the advisor has a duty to advise, it must be done collaboratively. This approach risks alienating the client and may not uncover the underlying reasons for their stated tolerance, leading to a less effective long-term advisory relationship. A third incorrect approach is to focus solely on the client's stated desire for high returns without adequately probing the associated risks. This prioritizes a superficial aspect of the client's request over a comprehensive understanding of their risk profile and capacity. It can lead to recommendations that expose the client to unacceptable levels of risk, violating the core principles of suitability and client protection mandated by regulatory bodies. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such a discrepancy should adopt a structured approach. First, Acknowledge the client's stated preference. Second, conduct a comprehensive review of all relevant factors: financial capacity, investment knowledge, experience, and stated objectives. Third, engage in open dialogue with the client, explaining any perceived misalignments using clear language and providing educational resources. Fourth, collaboratively develop an investment strategy that balances the client's preferences with their capacity and objectives, ensuring suitability and adherence to regulatory requirements. This iterative process of assessment, communication, and collaboration is key to providing sound and ethical financial advice. Question 8. What factors determine the most appropriate risk assessment approach for a client seeking advice under the EIAT and NEIEP test framework? Option A. The complexity of the investment products being considered and the candidate's personal investment experience. Option B. The firm's overall risk management policies and the prevailing market sentiment. Option C. The regulatory body's current guidelines on acceptable risk levels for all client types. Option D. The client's personal financial circumstances, investment objectives, and stated willingness to tolerate potential losses. The correct answer is D. The client's personal financial circumstances, investment objectives, and stated willingness to tolerate potential losses. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because the EIAT and NEIEP test candidate must move beyond a superficial understanding of risk assessment to apply it effectively in a practical, albeit hypothetical, context. The challenge lies in discerning which factors are truly determinative of an appropriate risk assessment approach, rather than merely relevant. This requires a nuanced understanding of the regulatory framework governing EIAT and NEIEP, which emphasizes a proactive and client-centric approach to risk. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it aligns with the core principles of responsible financial advice and regulatory compliance. By focusing on the client's specific circumstances, the candidate demonstrates an understanding that risk assessment is not a one-size-fits-all process. This client centricity is a cornerstone of ethical conduct and regulatory expectations, ensuring that advice is tailored and appropriate. It reflects a commitment to understanding the client's capacity and willingness to take risk, which is fundamental to providing suitable recommendations. An incorrect approach that prioritizes solely the firm's internal risk appetite without adequate consideration of the client's profile would represent a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This would breach the duty to act in the client's best interests and could lead to recommendations that are unsuitable, exposing the client to undue risk. Similarly, an approach that relies on generic risk categories without delving into the specifics of the client's financial situation and investment objectives would fail to meet the regulatory standard for a thorough and personalized risk assessment. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to understand the client's unique needs and circumstances, which is a direct contravention of regulatory requirements for client suitability. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, thoroughly understanding the client's financial situation, investment objectives, and risk tolerance. Second, evaluating the client's capacity to bear risk, considering their financial resources, time horizon, and knowledge of investments. Third, assessing the client's willingness to take risk, which involves understanding their psychological disposition towards potential losses. Finally, integrating these client-specific factors with the nature of the investment products and the prevailing market conditions to determine an appropriate risk assessment strategy. This iterative process ensures that the risk assessment is robust, personalized, and compliant with regulatory expectations. Question 9. The evaluation methodology shows that a candidate for the EIAT and NEIEP test is assessing a client's financial situation in anticipation of potential upcoming regulatory changes that could affect investment product suitability and disclosure requirements. Which approach to risk assessment best demonstrates professional competence and adherence to regulatory principles? Option A. Conducting an in-depth analysis of highly speculative and unlikely future regulatory changes, potentially leading to overly complex or impractical recommendations that do not address the client's immediate needs. Option B. Dismissing the possibility of significant regulatory changes altogether, as the focus should remain solely on maximizing the client's immediate financial returns based on existing rules. Option C. Focusing exclusively on the current regulatory framework, assuming that any future changes will be minor, and will not significantly alter the fundamental principles of financial advice. Option D. Prioritizing a thorough assessment of the client's current financial goals, risk tolerance, and existing portfolio, while also developing contingency plans that consider the potential impact of various plausible regulatory scenarios on the recommended strategies. The correct answer is D. Prioritizing a thorough assessment of the client's current financial goals, risk tolerance, and existing portfolio, while also developing contingency plans that consider the potential impact of various plausible regulatory scenarios on the recommended strategies. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because the EIAT and NEIEP test candidate must apply risk assessment principles in a context where the specific regulatory environment for financial advice is evolving. The candidate needs to demonstrate an understanding of how to identify, assess, and respond to risks that could impact the client's financial well-being and the advisor's compliance obligations, even when the exact regulatory landscape is not fully settled. Careful judgment is required to balance proactive risk management with the practicalities of implementing advice under potential future regulatory changes. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a comprehensive understanding of the client's current situation and future objectives, while also acknowledging and planning for potential regulatory shifts. This aligns with the EIAT and NEIEP tests' emphasis on client-centric advice and robust risk management. By considering a range of potential regulatory outcomes and their impact on the client's financial plan, the advisor demonstrates foresight and a commitment to providing advice that remains relevant and compliant over time. This proactive stance is ethically sound, as it aims to protect the client from unforeseen negative consequences arising from regulatory changes. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on current regulations without considering potential future changes fails to meet the professional standard of due diligence. This could lead to advice that becomes non-compliant or suboptimal once new regulations are enacted, potentially exposing the client to financial detriment and the advisor to regulatory sanctions. Another incorrect approach that overemphasizes speculative future regulations without grounding the assessment in the client's current circumstances and objectives would be unprofessional and impractical. This could lead to paralysis in decision-making or advice that is not relevant to the client's immediate needs. An approach that dismisses the impact of potential regulatory changes entirely, assuming they will not materialize or will be insignificant, demonstrates a lack of professional foresight and a failure to adhere to the principle of acting in the client's best interest. This could result in the client being unprepared for significant shifts in the regulatory environment, leading to unexpected costs or limitations on their financial strategies. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the client's objectives and risk tolerance. This should be followed by an assessment of the current regulatory environment and a proactive identification of potential future regulatory changes that could impact the client's plan. For each identified risk, the professional should evaluate its likelihood and potential impact, and then develop strategies to mitigate or adapt to these risks. This involves scenario planning and stress testing the financial plan against various regulatory outcomes, ensuring that the advice remains robust and client-focused. Question 10. Regulatory review indicates that a financial services firm is developing a new product. The candidate for the EIAT and NEIEP test is tasked with outlining the initial risk assessment approach for this product. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the principles of robust risk management expected under relevant regulatory frameworks? Option A. An approach that prioritizes the selection of risk mitigation measures based solely on their cost-effectiveness, even if they offer only minimal protection. Option B. A comprehensive approach that involves identifying potential risks across the product lifecycle, assessing their likelihood and impact, and proposing proportionate mitigation strategies with a plan for ongoing monitoring. Option C. A reactive approach that focuses primarily on identifying risks that have materialized in similar products offered by competitors in the past. Option D. A qualitative approach that relies heavily on the subjective opinions of senior management, without a structured framework for analysis or documentation. The correct answer is B. A comprehensive approach that involves identifying potential risks across the product lifecycle, assessing their likelihood and impact, and proposing proportionate mitigation strategies with a plan for ongoing monitoring. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the EIAT and NEIEP test candidate must interpret and apply risk assessment principles within a specific regulatory context, even when faced with incomplete or ambiguous information. The core of the challenge lies in moving beyond a superficial understanding of risk to a nuanced application that aligns with the test's objectives and the implied regulatory framework. Careful judgment is required to differentiate between a reactive, compliance-driven approach and a proactive, value-adding risk management strategy. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it demonstrates a comprehensive understanding of risk assessment as an integrated process. It involves not just identifying potential risks, but also evaluating their likelihood and impact, and then developing proportionate mitigation strategies. This aligns with the spirit of regulatory frameworks that aim to ensure robust risk management, thereby protecting investors and market integrity. Such an approach is proactive, forward-looking, and contributes to the overall resilience of the financial entity. It reflects a commitment to ethical conduct by prioritizing the prevention of harm and the maintenance of sound business practices. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on historical data without considering emerging trends fails to meet regulatory expectations for forward-looking risk assessment. This is an ethical failure because it can lead to a false sense of security and leave the entity vulnerable to unforeseen events, potentially breaching the duty of care owed to clients or stakeholders. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes cost saving over effective risk mitigation is a direct regulatory failure. Regulations typically mandate that risk management measures be adequate and effective, not merely the cheapest option. This can be an ethical lapse as it prioritizes financial gain over the safety and soundness of operations. A third incorrect approach that relies on subjective judgment without a structured framework is problematic because it lacks objectivity and consistency, making it difficult to audit or justify decisions. This can lead to regulatory scrutiny and potential sanctions due to a lack of demonstrable due diligence. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured risk assessment methodology. This includes defining the scope of the assessment, identifying potential risks through various techniques, e.g., brainstorming, scenario analysis, expert judgment, analyzing the likelihood and impact of identified risks, evaluating the existing controls, and determining the residual risk. Based on this evaluation, appropriate risk treatment strategies, e.g., avoidance, mitigation, transfer, acceptance, should be developed and implemented. Crucially, the process must include ongoing monitoring and review to ensure the effectiveness of controls and to adapt to changing risk landscapes. Professionals should always refer to the specific regulatory guidance applicable to their jurisdiction and the EIAT and NEIEP test objectives to ensure compliance and best practice. Question 11. Process analysis reveals that a candidate for the EIAT and NEIEP test is developing a comprehensive risk assessment strategy for the examination process. Which of the following approaches best demonstrates a professional and regulatory compliant method for identifying and prioritizing potential risks to the integrity of the EIAT and NEIEP test? Option A. Systematically identifying potential threats to the EIAT and NEIEP test's objectives, assessing their likelihood and impact, and prioritizing mitigation efforts based on this assessment. Option B. Documenting every minor technical glitch or potential inconvenience that has ever been reported in any testing environment, regardless of its relevance or probability of recurrence. Option C. Relying on informal discussions and rumors within the testing community to identify potential security vulnerabilities without formal verification. Option D. Focusing exclusively on risks that have materialized in past EIAT and NEIEP tests, ignoring any emerging or hypothetical threats. The correct answer is A. Systematically identifying potential threats to the EIAT and NEIEP test's objectives, assessing their likelihood and impact, and prioritizing mitigation efforts based on this assessment. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the EIAT and NEIEP test candidate must balance the need for thorough risk assessment with the practical constraints of time and available information. The core difficulty lies in identifying the most relevant and actionable risks without becoming overwhelmed by minor or speculative concerns. Careful judgment is required to prioritize risks that have the greatest potential impact on the integrity of the EIAT and NEIEP test process and its outcomes. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it systematically identifies potential threats to the EIAT and NEIEP tests' objectives, such as ensuring fair assessment, maintaining data security, and upholding the credibility of the certification. By focusing on the likelihood and impact of these threats, it allows for the allocation of resources to mitigate the most significant risks. This aligns with the overarching regulatory framework governing EIAT and NEIEP, which mandates robust security and integrity measures for all testing and certification processes. Ethical considerations also demand a proactive approach to safeguarding the test from any form of compromise. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on identifying every conceivable minor vulnerability without considering their likelihood or impact fails to provide a practical and actionable risk mitigation strategy. This can lead to wasted resources and a dilution of focus from more critical threats, potentially violating the spirit of the regulatory requirements for effective risk management. Another incorrect approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or unsubstantiated rumors, rather than a structured assessment of potential threats, lacks the rigor expected in a professional testing environment. This can lead to misallocation of resources and a failure to address genuine risks, potentially undermining the integrity of the EIAT and NEIEP test and leading to regulatory noncompliance. A third incorrect approach that dismisses potential risk due to a lack of immediate evidence, without considering future possibilities or the evolving nature of threats, is also professionally unacceptable. This reactive stance can leave the EIAT and NEIEP test vulnerable to unforeseen issues, failing to meet the proactive risk management expectations. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with clearly defining the objectives of the EIAT and NEIEP test. This is followed by a systematic identification of potential threats to these objectives, considering both internal and external factors. Each identified threat should then be assessed based on its likelihood of occurrence and its potential impact. This assessment should inform a prioritization of risks, allowing for the development of targeted mitigation strategies for the most significant threats. Regular review and updating of the risk assessment are crucial to adapt to changing circumstances and emerging threats. Question 12. The performance metrics show a slight but consistent decline in client satisfaction scores over the last 2 quarters. What is the most appropriate next step in assessing the potential risks associated with this trend? Option A. Initiate a comprehensive review of internal operational procedures, client communication protocols, and staff training effectiveness, while also gathering qualitative feedback from a sample of affected clients and analyzing recent market shifts impacting client expectations. Option B. Immediately revise the firm's service delivery model to introduce new client engagement technologies, assuming the current methods are outdated and causing dissatisfaction. Option C. Advise senior management that the decline is likely due to seasonal market fluctuations and no further action is required at this time. Option D. Focus solely on analyzing competitor service offerings to identify if they are providing a superior client experience, as this is the most probable cause of declining scores. The correct answer is A. Initiate a comprehensive review of internal operational procedures, client communication protocols, and staff training effectiveness, while also gathering qualitative feedback from a sample of affected clients and analyzing recent market shifts impacting client expectations. Explanation. Scenario analysis. The scenario presents a common challenge where initial performance metrics suggest a potential issue, but the underlying causes are not immediately apparent. The professional is faced with the need to move beyond superficial data interpretation to a more robust risk assessment. This requires understanding the limitations of raw performance data and the importance of qualitative factors and contextual information in identifying true risks. The challenge lies in distinguishing between a temporary fluctuation and a systemic risk that could impact client outcomes or regulatory compliance. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a multifaceted risk assessment that goes beyond the initial performance metrics. This includes gathering additional qualitative data, such as client feedback and market conditions, and considering the firm's internal processes and controls. This comprehensive approach aligns with regulatory expectations for robust risk management frameworks, which mandate proactive identification and assessment of potential risks. By seeking to understand the root causes, the professional demonstrates due diligence and a commitment to client welfare and regulatory adherence, as required by EIAT and NEIEP principles. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately implement significant operational changes based solely on the initial performance metrics. This fails to acknowledge that performance metrics can be influenced by numerous transient factors and may not accurately reflect underlying risks. Such an approach could lead to unnecessary disruption, increased costs, and potentially introduce new risks without addressing the actual problem, violating the principle of prudent risk management. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the performance metrics as insignificant without further investigation. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and a failure to heed potential warning signs. Regulatory frameworks, including those underpinning EIAT and NEIEP, expect professionals to investigate anomalies and potential risks, not ignore them. This approach could lead to missed opportunities to mitigate significant risks, potentially resulting in client harm or regulatory breaches. A third incorrect approach is to focus solely on external market factors as the cause without considering internal operational or procedural issues. While external factors can contribute to performance variations, a thorough risk assessment must also scrutinize internal processes, controls, and staff capabilities. Overlooking internal factors can lead to a misdiagnosis of the risk and the implementation of ineffective mitigation strategies, which is a failure of professional responsibility and regulatory compliance. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic risk assessment process. This begins with acknowledging the presented data but immediately moves to contextualization and deeper investigation. The process involves 1. Data review and initial hypothesis. Understand what the metrics are showing and form preliminary ideas about potential causes. 2. Information gathering. Collect both quantitative and qualitative data from various sources, internal reports, client interactions, market analysis, regulatory updates. 3. Root cause analysis. Systematically identify the underlying reasons for observed performance, distinguishing between transient issues and systemic risks. 4. Risk evaluation. Assess the likelihood and impact of identified risks. 5. Mitigation planning. Develop and implement appropriate strategies to manage or reduce the identified risks. 6. Monitoring and review. Continuously track performance and the effectiveness of mitigation strategies. This structured approach ensures that decisions are evidence-based, comprehensive, and aligned with professional and regulatory standards. Question 13. Cost-benefit analysis shows a new investment strategy offers a projected 15% annual return with a 5% cost ratio, significantly outperforming the firm's current offerings. However, the strategy involves complex derivatives and has limited historical data in volatile market conditions. Which of the following represents the most prudent and compliant course of action for the firm? Option A. Immediately adopt the new strategy to capitalize on the projected returns, assuming the cost-benefit analysis is sufficient justification. Option B. Rely on the positive cost-benefit ratio and the projected returns as primary indicators of suitability, proceeding with broad implementation. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive suitability assessment for the target client segments, a thorough risk analysis of the derivative components, and develop specific risk mitigation controls before considering implementation. Option D. Implement the strategy for a small subset of clients to gauge its performance, without extensive prior risk assessment, to gather real-time data. The correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive suitability assessment for the target client segments, a thorough risk analysis of the derivative components, and develop specific risk mitigation controls before considering implementation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the potential benefits of a new investment strategy against its inherent risks and the regulatory obligations of the firm. The challenge lies in ensuring that any proposed strategy, even one with a seemingly favorable cost-benefit analysis, adheres strictly to the EIAT and NEIEP test requirements regarding suitability, client best interests, and appropriate risk management. The firm must not be swayed solely by the projected financial gains, but must rigorously assess the alignment of the strategy with regulatory mandates. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a comprehensive review that extends beyond the initial cost-benefit analysis. It involves a thorough assessment of the strategy's suitability for the target client base, ensuring it aligns with their risk tolerance, investment objectives, and financial situation as mandated by EIAT and NEIEP test principles. This includes evaluating the strategy's complexity, liquidity, and potential impact on client portfolios in various market conditions. Furthermore, It necessitates a robust risk assessment and the implementation of appropriate controls to mitigate identified risks, thereby upholding the firm's fiduciary duty and regulatory compliance. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the positive cost-benefit ratio without a deeper suitability and risk assessment fails to meet regulatory expectations. This approach risks recommending investments that are not appropriate for clients, potentially leading to financial harm and regulatory breaches. It demonstrates a failure to act in the client's best interest, a core tenet of EIAT and NEIEP test regulations. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes speed of implementation over thorough due diligence overlooks the critical need for comprehensive risk management and compliance checks. This can result in the adoption of flawed strategies or the failure to identify and address potential regulatory violations, exposing both the firm and its clients to undue risk. A third incorrect approach that relies on historical performance data without considering future market volatility or the specific characteristics of the proposed strategy is also flawed. This approach neglects the forward-looking nature of investment advice and regulatory requirements, which demand an assessment of potential future outcomes and risks. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the client's needs and regulatory requirements. This is followed by a thorough evaluation of any proposed strategy, including its cost-benefit analysis, suitability for the client, and associated risks. A critical step involves stress testing the strategy under various market scenarios and ensuring that robust risk management and compliance procedures are in place before implementation. This systematic approach ensures that all regulatory and ethical obligations are met, safeguarding both the client and the firm. Question 14. The control framework reveals a critical data point required for an urgent client report under the EIAT and NEIEP test, but access to the specific client file is restricted by a security protocol that the individual does not currently have clearance for. The report deadline is imminent, and the delay in obtaining the data could negatively impact the client. Option A. Follow the established procedure to formally request elevated access to the client file, documenting the urgency of the request and the potential impact of delay, while continuing to work on other aspects of the report that do not require the restricted data. Option B. Search for publicly available information that might approximate the required data, even if it is less precise, to meet the deadline. Option C. Directly contact the client and request they provide the specific data point directly, bypassing internal data handling procedures. Option D. Attempt to access the client file using a colleague's credentials, as they have the necessary clearance and are temporarily unavailable. The correct answer is A. Follow the established procedure to formally request elevated access to the client file, documenting the urgency of the request and the potential impact of delay, while continuing to work on other aspects of the report that do not require the restricted data. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance the immediate need for information with the regulatory obligation to protect client data and maintain confidentiality. The EIAT and NEIEP test context implies a regulated environment where data privacy and security are paramount. Careful judgment is required to determine the appropriate course of action that upholds both operational efficiency and compliance. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes adherence to the EIAT and NEIEP tests, established data handling protocols, and regulatory guidelines. By seeking authorized access through the designated channels, the professional demonstrates a commitment to data integrity, client confidentiality, and regulatory compliance. This upholds the trust placed in them by clients and the regulatory bodies overseeing the EIAT and NEIEP test. It aligns with the principle of least privilege and ensures that data access is logged and auditable, a key component of robust control frameworks. An incorrect approach that involves bypassing established security protocols to access the data directly, even with good intentions, represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This action undermines the control framework designed to protect sensitive information, potentially leading to data breaches, unauthorized disclosure, and violations of privacy regulations relevant to the EIAT and NEIEP test. Such a bypass also erodes the integrity of audit trails and internal controls, making it difficult to track data access and usage, which is a critical failure in a regulated environment. Another incorrect approach, such as guessing or attempting to circumvent security measures through technical exploits, is not only a regulatory violation, but also an unethical act that could have severe legal and professional consequences. A professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the EIAT and NEIEP test regulatory framework, including data access policies and security protocols. When faced with a need for information that is not immediately accessible, the first step should be to consult internal policies and procedures. If these are unclear or insufficient, seeking guidance from a supervisor or the designated compliance officer is crucial. The principle of when in doubt, ask is paramount. Professionals must always err on the side of caution and prioritize compliance over expediency, ensuring that all actions are documented and justifiable within the established regulatory boundaries. Question 15. The risk matrix shows a moderate likelihood of a specific procedural error occurring during the administration of the EIAT and NEIEP test, with a high impact if it does occur. Which of the following actions best aligns with the regulatory framework for the EIAT and NEIEP test? Option A. Seek an external consultant's opinion on the best way to mitigate procedural errors, without specific reference to EIAT and NEIEP test regulations. Option B. Implement enhanced monitoring protocols for the specific procedural step identified, as mandated by the EIAT and NEIEP test guidelines for high-impact risks. Option C. Conduct a general refresher training for all test administrators on common procedural errors, as this is a standard best practice for test security. Option D. Document the risk in the internal risk register and proceed with standard administration procedures, as the likelihood is only moderate. Correct answer is B. Implement enhanced monitoring protocols for the specific procedural step identified, as mandated by the EIAT and NEIEP test guidelines for high-impact risks. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to interpret a risk matrix in the context of specific regulatory requirements for the EIAT and NEIEP test, rather than relying on general industry best practices or personal judgment. The risk matrix is a tool, but its application must be guided by the precise dictates of the relevant regulatory framework. The challenge lies in discerning which actions align with the EIAT and NEIEP test-specific mandates for risk assessment and mitigation, especially when faced with potentially conflicting interpretations or less stringent alternatives. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it demonstrates a commitment to adhering strictly to the EIAT and NEIEP tests regulatory framework. This involves understanding that the risk matrix is not a standalone guide, but must be interpreted through the lens of established rules and guidelines. By prioritizing actions that directly address identified risks in a manner consistent with the EIAT and NEIEP test requirements, the professional ensures compliance, upholds ethical standards, and protects the integrity of the testing process. This approach reflects a deep understanding of the regulatory environment and a commitment to responsible conduct. An incorrect approach that relies solely on the visual representation of the risk matrix without considering the specific EIAT and NEIEP test regulations fails to meet the required standard. This could lead to actions that, while appearing reasonable on the matrix, are not compliant with the detailed provisions of the EIAT and NEIEP test. For instance, choosing a mitigation strategy that is less rigorous than mandated by the EIAT and NEIEP test, even if it appears sufficient on the matrix, constitutes a regulatory failure. Similarly, an approach that prioritizes expediency or cost-effectiveness over strict adherence to EIAT and NEIEP test guidelines represents an ethical lapse, as it potentially compromises the fairness and security of the examination. Another incorrect approach might involve seeking external advice that is not aligned with the specific EIAT and NEIEP test framework, leading to misinterpretation and noncompliance. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should begin with a thorough understanding of the specific regulatory framework governing the EIAT and NEIEP test. This involves consulting the official documentation, guidelines, and any supplementary materials provided by the examining body. When presented with a tool like a risk matrix, the professional must then critically evaluate how the information presented on the matrix aligns with and is constrained by these specific regulations. The decision-making process should prioritize actions that are demonstrably compliant with the EIAT and NEIEP test requirements, even if other options appear superficially attractive. This involves a systematic review of potential actions against the regulatory checklist, ensuring that no aspect of the EIAT and NEIEP test's mandates is overlooked. Question 16. The assessment process reveals that an individual has successfully passed the EIAT and NEIEP test. They are now considering how to best leverage this achievement in their professional role, specifically regarding client interactions that might involve discussing investment strategies and potential financial products. Which of the following actions best reflects a professional and compliant approach to utilizing the knowledge gained from the EIAT and NEIEP test in this context? Option A. Offer to guide clients through the process of selecting financial products, using the knowledge from the test to explain the features and benefits of various options, without making explicit recommendations. Option B. Provide general educational information about financial markets and different types of financial products, clearly stating that this is not regulated advice and that clients should seek independent, authorized advice for personal recommendations. Option C. Immediately begin offering personalized recommendations on specific investment products and financial planning strategies to clients, assuming the test completion grants this authority. Option D. Interpret the EIAT and NEIEP test as a direct license to provide regulated financial advice and proceed to offer such advice to clients, relying on the test's validation of their understanding. The correct answer is C. Immediately begin offering personalized recommendations on specific investment products and financial planning strategies to clients, assuming the test completion grants this authority. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge where an individual, having recently completed the EIAT and NEIEP test, is eager to apply their newfound knowledge. However, they are faced with a situation that requires careful consideration of the scope of their certification and the specific regulatory boundaries within which they must operate. The challenge lies in distinguishing between general financial advisory principles and the specific competencies and permissions granted by the EIAT and NEIEP test, particularly concerning the provision of regulated advice. Misinterpreting the scope of their qualification could lead to regulatory breaches and client detriment. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach demonstrates an understanding of the limitations and specific purpose of the EIAT and NEIEP test. This qualification is designed to equip individuals with knowledge and skills relevant to specific aspects of financial services, but it does not automatically confer the authority to provide regulated financial advice. Best professional practice dictates that individuals must operate strictly within the scope of their qualifications and any associated regulatory permissions. Therefore, recognizing the need for further authorization or supervision before engaging in regulated activities is paramount. This aligns with the ethical obligation to act with competence and due care, ensuring that clients receive advice only from appropriately qualified and authorized individuals. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves assuming that successful completion of the EIAT and NEIEP test is sufficient to provide regulated financial advice. This represents a significant regulatory failure, as it bypasses the necessary authorization and licensing requirements mandated by the relevant regulatory framework. Ethically, it is a breach of trust and competence, potentially exposing clients to unqualified advice. Another incorrect approach is to offer general financial information without clearly delineating that it does not constitute regulated advice. While seemingly benign, this can mislead clients into believing they are receiving formal recommendations, creating a false sense of security and potentially leading to poor financial decisions. This approach fails to uphold the principle of transparency and can be construed as an attempt to circumvent regulatory requirements. A third incorrect approach is to seek to provide regulated advice by relying solely on general industry knowledge, rather than the specific competencies validated by the EIAT and NEIEP test and any required regulatory permissions. This demonstrates a lack of understanding of the structured and regulated nature of financial advice provision, where specific qualifications and authorizations are non-negotiable. It is a failure to adhere to the principle of acting within one's scope of authority and competence. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance and client protection. This involves 1. Clearly understanding the scope and limitations of their qualifications and certifications. 2. Identifying whether a proposed action falls within the definition of regulated activity under the relevant regulatory framework. 3. Seeking appropriate authorization, licensing, or supervision if regulated activities are to be undertaken. 4. Maintaining transparency with clients regarding the nature and limitations of the information or services being provided. 5. Continuously updating knowledge of regulatory requirements and professional standards. Question 17. System analysis indicates that a candidate for the EIAT and NEIEP test is undergoing the initial client assessment phase. The assessor must determine the appropriate scope of information to gather and the procedures to follow. Which of the following best reflects the required approach for this assessment phase, strictly adhering to the EIAT and NEIEP test's regulatory framework? Option A. Focus on gathering broad financial background information that might be relevant to any financial advisory role, without strict adherence to the specific documentation requirements of the EIAT and NEIEP test. Option B. Incorporate general industry best practices for client onboarding, even if not explicitly detailed in the EIAT and NEIEP test, to ensure a comprehensive client profile. Option C. Gather information and follow procedures explicitly mandated by the EIAT and NEIEP test regulations for client assessment, ensuring all steps are documented within the exam-specific guidelines. Option D. Apply a combination of EIAT and NEIEP test requirements with elements from other recognized financial advisory standards to create a robust assessment process. Correct answer is C. Gather information and follow procedures explicitly mandated by the EIAT and NEIEP test regulations for client assessment, ensuring all steps are documented within the exam-specific guidelines. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to navigate the complexities of client onboarding and regulatory compliance within the specific framework of the EIAT and NEIEP test. The core difficulty lies in balancing the need to gather sufficient information for a comprehensive client assessment with the imperative to adhere strictly to the established regulatory guidelines for the EIAT and NEIEP test, ensuring no procedural shortcuts are taken that could compromise compliance or client suitability. Careful judgment is required to identify and apply the correct procedures without introducing external or irrelevant regulatory considerations. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it demonstrates a thorough understanding and strict adherence to the EIAT and NEIEP test-specific regulatory framework. By focusing solely on the information and procedures mandated by these regulations for client assessment, it ensures that the onboarding process is compliant, efficient, and tailored to the requirements of the exam. This approach prioritizes regulatory integrity and avoids the introduction of extraneous or potentially conflicting requirements, which is crucial for maintaining the validity and credibility of the assessment process. It reflects a commitment to operating within the defined boundaries of the EIAT and NEIEP test. An incorrect approach that relies on general industry best practices not explicitly defined or incorporated within the EIAT and NEIEP test framework represents a regulatory failure. It suggests a lack of precise knowledge of the specific requirements of the EIAT and NEIEP test, leading to the potential for misapplication of standards or the introduction of irrelevant procedures. This can result in an incomplete or inaccurate client assessment according to the exam's criteria, potentially invalidating the process. Ethically, it demonstrates a failure to uphold the specific professional obligations tied to the EIAT and NEIEP test. Another incorrect approach that incorporates elements from other, unspecified regulatory bodies or general financial advisory standards, even if seemingly beneficial, constitutes a significant regulatory failure. The EIAT and NEIEP test operates under its own defined jurisdiction. Introducing external regulations, even if they appear to enhance due diligence, violates the principle of strict jurisdictional compliance. This can lead to confusion, procedural errors, and a failure to meet the precise standards set by the EIAT and NEIEP test, thereby compromising the integrity of the assessment. It also indicates a lack of discipline in adhering to the defined scope of practice for this specific exam. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should begin with a clear identification of the governing regulatory framework in this case, the EIAT and NEIEP test. All actions, procedures, and information gathering must be directly traceable to and justified by these specific regulations. Professionals should actively seek to understand the precise requirements and limitations of the EIAT and NEIEP test. When faced with ambiguity or the temptation to apply broader knowledge, the guiding principle must be to return to the specific rules of the EIAT and NEIEP test. If external knowledge is considered, it must be evaluated solely for its direct applicability and explicit inclusion within the EIAT and NEIEP test framework, rather than as a default standard. Question 18. Market research demonstrates that prospective clients often feel overwhelmed by initial information gathering processes. Considering the EIAT and NEIEP test's emphasis on client suitability and regulatory compliance, Which of the following approaches best balances the need for comprehensive client data with a positive client experience during the initial engagement phase? Option A. Providing a basic template for the client to fill out at their leisure, with minimal guidance on the specific details required. Option B. Proceeding with initial investment recommendations based on general market trends, and then requesting detailed client information to confirm suitability. Option C. Engaging in a free-flowing, informal conversation to gather initial impressions, and then compiling the necessary information retrospectively. Option D. Presenting a detailed, standardized questionnaire that clearly outlines the purpose of each section, and offering to guide the client through it, answering any questions they may have. The correct answer is D. Presenting a detailed, standardized questionnaire that clearly outlines the purpose of each section, and offering to guide the client through it, answering any questions they may have. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an EIAT and NEIEP test candidate to discern the most appropriate method for gathering client information, balancing regulatory compliance with client relationship management. The core of the challenge lies in understanding the nuances of client onboarding and the regulatory imperative to obtain accurate and complete information without alienating potential clients. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a structured, compliant, and client-centric method for information gathering. By utilizing a standardized questionnaire that is both comprehensive and explained clearly to the client, the professional adheres to regulatory requirements for client due diligence and suitability assessments. This method ensures that all necessary information is collected systematically, providing a solid foundation for subsequent advice and demonstrating a commitment to regulatory standards. It also fosters trust by being transparent about the process. An incorrect approach that involves solely relying on informal conversation fails to meet regulatory requirements for documented client information. This could lead to inadequate suitability assessments and potential breaches of due diligence obligations, exposing both the client and the professional to risk. Another incorrect approach, which involves providing a generic information-gathering template without explanation or customization, demonstrates a lack of client engagement and may result in incomplete or irrelevant information being provided by the client, undermining the effectiveness of the assessment and potentially violating ethical duties of care. Third incorrect approach, which involves delaying the information-gathering process until after initial recommendations are made, is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This fundamentally undermines the principle of suitability, as recommendations must be based on a thorough understanding of the client's circumstances, risk tolerance, and objectives, which can only be ascertained through proper information gathering. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear understanding of the regulatory framework governing client onboarding and suitability. Professionals must first identify the mandatory information required by regulations. Then, they should consider the most effective and efficient methods for obtaining this information, always prioritizing client understanding and cooperation. This involves selecting appropriate tools, such as standardized questionnaires, and ensuring clear communication about their purpose and necessity. Finally, professionals must critically evaluate the completeness and accuracy of the information gathered to ensure it adequately supports the subsequent advice provided, thereby upholding both regulatory compliance and ethical client care. Question 19. The performance metrics show a candidate scoring consistently high on objective, quantifiable tasks related to the EIAT and NEIEP test, yet qualitative feedback from a supervisor suggests a significant lack of initiative and proactive problem solving. How should this discrepancy be addressed to ensure a fair and comprehensive evaluation? Option A. Prioritize the objective performance metrics as the definitive measure of competence, disregarding the qualitative feedback as potentially subjective or influenced by personal bias. Option B. Conduct a follow-up interview with the supervisor to gather specific examples of the observed lack of initiative and explore potential contributing factors, while also reviewing the candidate's objective performance data for any subtle indicators of these qualitative concerns. Option C. Attempt to average the quantitative scores with a subjective interpretation of the qualitative feedback to arrive at a blended overall performance rating. Option D. Immediately adjust the candidate's overall score downwards based on the supervisor's qualitative assessment, assuming it reflects a critical deficiency not captured by objective measures. Correct answer is B. Conduct a follow-up interview with the supervisor to gather specific examples of the observed lack of initiative and explore potential contributing factors, while also reviewing the candidate's objective performance data for any subtle indicators of these qualitative concerns. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the need for accurate performance assessment with the potential for bias introduced by subjective qualitative feedback. The EIAT and NEIEP test framework emphasizes objective evaluation where possible, but also acknowledges the importance of qualitative insights for a holistic understanding of an individual's capabilities. The challenge lies in determining how to integrate these different types of data without compromising the integrity of the assessment or unfairly disadvantaging an individual. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a structured, evidence-based method for reconciling quantitative and qualitative data. By seeking corroborating evidence for subjective feedback and ensuring that any qualitative input is directly tied to observable behaviors or outcomes relevant to the EIAT and NEIEP test competencies, it upholds the principles of fairness and objectivity. This method aligns with the regulatory framework's emphasis on reliable and valid assessment, ensuring that conclusions drawn are well supported and defensible. An incorrect approach that relies solely on the qualitative feedback without seeking further objective evidence fails to meet the standards of the EIAT and NEIEP test. This could lead to biased assessments based on personal perceptions rather than demonstrable performance, potentially violating ethical guidelines regarding fair evaluation. Another incorrect approach that dismisses all qualitative feedback in favor of purely quantitative metrics overlooks valuable insights that could provide a more complete picture of an individual's strengths and areas for development, thereby failing to fully leverage the assessment framework's potential. A third incorrect approach that attempts to average or combine disparate qualitative feedback without a clear methodology for weighting or validation risks, creating an artificial and potentially misleading overall score, undermining the credibility of the assessment. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that involves first identifying the specific competencies being assessed by the EIAT and NEIEP test. They should then critically evaluate both quantitative performance metrics and qualitative feedback, looking for alignment and discrepancies. When discrepancies arise, the professional should investigate further by seeking specific examples or evidence that supports or refutes the qualitative observations. This systematic approach ensures that all available data is considered in a balanced and objective manner, leading to a fair and accurate assessment that adheres to the regulatory framework. Question 20. The audit findings indicate a recurring issue where clients, particularly those with limited financial literacy, are proceeding with investments in complex structured products without a demonstrably clear understanding of the associated risks and payout mechanisms, despite the firm's existing suitability assessment procedures. Option A. Rely on the existing suitability questionnaire to infer client understanding of complex products, assuming that if a client meets the suitability criteria, they implicitly understand the product. Option B. Increase the frequency of internal compliance training sessions on complex financial products for all client-facing staff. Option C. Advise clients to seek independent financial advice for all complex structured product investments without providing any internal verification of their understanding. Option D. Implement a mandatory client sign-off on a simplified, jargon-free summary document outlining the key features, risks, and potential outcomes of any complex structured product before execution. The correct answer is D. Implement a mandatory client sign-off on a simplified, jargon-free summary document outlining the key features, risks, and potential outcomes of any complex structured product before execution. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the audit findings highlight a potential gap in the firm's adherence to the EIAT and NEIEP test requirements, specifically concerning the documentation and verification of client understanding of complex financial instruments. The challenge lies in balancing the need for thorough compliance with the practicalities of client interaction and the firm's operational efficiency. Careful judgment is required to determine the most effective and compliant method for addressing this deficiency without unduly burdening clients or compromising the integrity of the advisory process. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it directly addresses the identified audit finding by implementing a structured, documented process for verifying client comprehension of complex instruments. This aligns with the spirit and letter of EIAT and NEIEP test guidelines, which emphasize client suitability and understanding. By requiring a specific sign-off on a summary document, the firm creates a clear audit trail demonstrating that reasonable steps were taken to ensure the client grasped the implications of the recommended products. This proactive measure mitigates future compliance risks and reinforces the firm's commitment to client best interests, a core ethical and regulatory tenet. An incorrect approach that involves merely verbally confirming client understanding, without any written record, fails to meet the EIAT and NEIEP tests' implicit requirement for demonstrable evidence of client comprehension. This creates a significant compliance risk, as the firm cannot prove that adequate steps were taken if challenged. Ethically, it falls short of the duty of care owed to clients, particularly when dealing with complex products where misunderstandings can have severe financial consequences. Another incorrect approach, such as relying solely on the client's initial suitability questionnaire to infer understanding of complex instruments, is also professionally unacceptable. The suitability questionnaire typically assesses risk tolerance and financial goals, not necessarily a deep comprehension of the mechanics and risks of specific, intricate products. This approach ignores the audit findings' specific concern about understanding complex instruments and represents a failure to adapt compliance procedures to the evolving nature of financial products and client needs, potentially violating regulatory expectations for ongoing client assessment. A further incorrect approach, which involves updating internal training materials but not implementing a client-facing verification process, addresses the knowledge gap internally but fails to rectify the external compliance deficiency. While improved training is beneficial, it does not, on its own, provide the necessary evidence that clients understand the products they are investing in. This leaves the firm vulnerable to regulatory scrutiny and fails to adequately protect the client from potential harm due to misunderstanding. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic review of audit findings, identifying the specific regulatory or ethical principles that are potentially being breached. Professionals should then brainstorm multiple potential solutions, evaluating each against the relevant regulatory framework, ethical codes, and practical feasibility. The chosen solution must demonstrably address the identified deficiency, create a robust audit trail, and uphold the firm's fiduciary responsibilities to its clients. This often involves a combination of enhanced internal processes, improved documentation, and targeted client communication strategies.